Welcome inside the War Room. I'm your host, Andrew Valancourt, and we're back today for episode 19 of the Dynasty War Room podcast. On today's episode, we're going to talk Dynasty busts. So last week, we talked about Dynasty breakouts. This week, we got the opposite end of the spectrum, players that we think will be valued significantly less next year at this time. And we have a full definition for what we actually think a bust will qualify as, but we'll get to that in just a minute. First, I just want to remind everyone, last week we mentioned that we had a big announcement on today's show, so we're going to get to that in just a moment. But before I do, I want to remind everybody to follow us on Twitter at Dynasty War Room. If you've missed any of our previous episodes, you can go back and catch those as well on pretty much any platform that carries podcasts. We're on everything, Spotify, Apple, YouTube, you name it. We are on it. So go back, check everything out. And with all that being said, let's just jump straight to the announcement. So I hinted at it a bit on social media over the week, but I will be starting a new Dynasty League for podcast listeners. So we're the Dynasty War Room Listener League. It's going to be starting up this summer. So if you are listening to this right now, you are cordially invited to join the league. It's going to be a 12-team Superflex PPR tight end premium league. That's my preferred Dynasty settings. It's going to be a $50 buy-in per season. We'll have the first 2 years paid up front, so we don't have to worry about anyone leaving. So it should be a great time, should be a really fun league. So if you are listening right now, go ahead and reach out on Twitter at Dynasty War Room. You can send me an email at our podcast show email at dynastywarroompodcast@gmail.com. So again, that's dynastywarroompodcast@gmail.com for those of you who are not on Twitter. You can also find us on Facebook as well. So you can search the show name, Dynasty War Room. We do have a page on there as well. Feel free to reach out there if that is more convenient for you. Or if you know me personally, just send me a text and we'll get you in the league. So excited for that. It'll be a startup draft. At some point this summer, once the league is full, the first 12 people to pay their league dues will be given a spot in the league. As you can imagine, we'll probably frequently discuss trades and various things in that league throughout the course of this show, and just wanted to put that out in the world. I'm excited for it, and if you've been thinking about joining a Dynasty League, or you are already in several but you want to add another one, this will be the place for you, and we will be happy to have you. So with all that being said, let's jump into the rest of this episode. Dynasty busts. So you can use this information to your advantage when you're drafting against me in our startup. And the players that I have today, I have 3 players at each position. And the definition that I've come up with, because bust is always a very difficult term to throw around in fantasy because it can mean a lot of different things. So the way that I view it for the purposes of Dynasty and this show will be a player that loses significant market value between now and this time next year because of more than just age. So someone that's going to disappoint you throughout the season or give you headaches as you try to set your lineups because of either inconsistent or subpar performance. These are players that I'm not trying to acquire even at fair market price. There's a lot of guys that we're going to talk about on the show that I think the market is actually pretty spot on for, that, they're priced fairly. They, factor in the risk and reward on both sides. But even with that being said, I'm still not going after these players. So that's a definition we're going to go off of. There's some players that I think will be disappointing for just the season, but not necessarily in terms of a holistic dynasty approach, so they won't be on this list. The players that we're going to talk about today, I essentially think their dynasty value will, not in all cases, but it will pretty much tank their entire value between now and next year. In some cases, when we talk about a little bit more highly ranked players, I won't necessarily mean that they're going to go from, being a regular starter to just complete bust that you can't play at all. But players that I think will lose some pretty considerable trade value between now and next year because of various things that will happen, whether it's just purely bad performance, whether it's injury, contract situation, being traded or signing to a new team next year after a below average season on the field. So all those things will kind of factor in to the players that we're going to talk about today. So we'll start at quarterback, as we usually do. And first up on this list is a young player that I unfortunately drafted in a league last year, as I'm sure many of you probably did as well. And he was a number 1 overall pick, and that's Bryce Young. So he's being ranked right now on Keep Trade Cut as the QB 20. Quarterback is probably the one position here where we don't really have anybody ranked, all that high as a bust, because I actually do think that the quarterback market right now has it generally correct. There's not a lot of players where I'm looking at and it's, I think they're terribly mispriced, or where I see a very clear bust type of scenario that at least doesn't involve, injury. But with Bryce Young, he was awful last year, and sure, there could and should be some improvement from Bryce Young this year. He's got a new coaching staff, which has worked well with Geno Smith in the past, Baker Mayfield last year in Tampa Bay. So everything is there for Bryce Young to be better. They invested in the offensive line. They drafted wide receivers. They traded for Deontay Johnson. They now added Jonathan Brooks at running back. I mean, literally everything is there for him to succeed. However, I didn't see anything from Bryce Young on the field that, even with these added weapons, makes me think he can be a good to great fantasy quarterback. Could he stick around in the NFL for a few years as a below average starter? Absolutely. I mean, he's the number 1 overall pick. They traded the entire farm to acquire him. He's going to have a very long leash. He'll almost guaranteed be the starting quarterback in Carolina for a minimum of the next 2 seasons. So that in and of itself gives him some value insulation to where he's not going to drop from, he's not going to go from quarterback 20 to quarterback 40 just from having one bad season. But I do think we're going to see something where, he drops off to the back of the 20s, mid to late 20s. I don't see any scenario where, even if Bryce Young plays better on the field, I don't see how he's going to be a good fantasy quarterback. He doesn't run. He doesn't possess, elite arm talent. This is not someone that just you look at him and you go, oh yeah, this is a prototypical NFL quarterback. He can bomb it down the field. He's going to just... He's an accuracy guy. He's a shorter NFL quarterback. We've seen, we actually saw that gave him a little bit of a problem here and there last year with tip passes, but nothing that I saw last season makes me think that he will ever be someone that you can count on in your Dynasty league as a starter, even in a Superflex league. I just don't see him as a QB2. I don't think there's any chance that he ends up as a top 12 quarterback. I don't think there's any world where he is a solid number 1, like somebody that you would build your franchise around. I just don't see it. He's a QB3 flex bye week, type of guy. And given being the number 1 pick and considering that he's still ranked at QB20, which is not great, not bad. It's okay. It's in the middle. I don't think that is a price that I would want to buy him at, even though I do think that it's a relatively fair market price. It's not something that I am interested in. I don't see it. I think there is a number of other players. I think you could take any of the first round rookies this year, and I would rather have any of those players. I'd rather have Bo Nix. I'd rather have J.J. McCarthy, Drake May. The only one that you could maybe throw a question at would be Michael Penix, but that's simply because he's probably not going to see the field for 2 years. If he were starting right away, or even if we knew that he was guaranteed to start in 2025, I would rather have Michael Penix. So I think that pretty much should tell you what I think of Bryce Young. The fact that I would rather have, Bo Nix, that I would rather have Will Levis, guys kind of in that range. So I'm out on Bryce Young. He does have some trade value. He's still valued relatively highly, and of course, playing quarterback will certainly give him that, along with his name value. But I think we're in for a rough season for the Carolina offense, and even if there are other players that are fantasy relevant, I think Jonathan Brooks can be very good. I think that some of the receivers can have pretty, solid to, maybe a wide receiver 3 type of season from somebody like Deontay Johnson, and Xavier Legette has some talent, but I think it's going to be a situation where it's going to be the skill position players that benefit more from the improved offense, and Bryce Young is basically, I just don't see a ceiling with him. I think he's kind of a floor play at quarterback, and that's not something I'm interested in terms of a building block for Dynasty. Next up on my list is Deshaun Watson. So he's currently valued at QB 26, which is, I actually think, again, fair. A lot of the players on this list, I think their current value on Keep Trade Cut is fair, because I don't think I'm the only one that is down on a lot of the players on this list. I don't know that I have a ton of names that you're going to go, oh, that's, totally different. I've never heard that. Like, a lot of these players are going to be guys that I think there is some general skepticism about. And Deshaun Watson is somebody that, to me, did not play well last year. He battled injuries. He hasn't played a full season since 2020. I mean, that's coming back and returning to form as a top 5, top 10 quarterback, and then essentially not playing for the better part of, 4 seasons, 3-4 seasons. I just don't think that that's a very likely outcome for him to return to that level. He flashed in certain moments. He does have some running upside, which I think makes him actually somebody that I would rather have in Dynasty than Bryce Young. So Bryce Young, I think you can trade him straight up for Deshaun Watson. At least on Keep Trade Cut, Young is being valued more. So I think at least with Watson, that he's going to be there for a few years because of his contract, which is quite terrible. He does have some weapons. He's at least shown something in the past, but count me as a skeptic. I just don't know that he has enough left in the tank to be a top 10 quarterback or be a QB1 in Dynasty. I think at best you're looking at a boom bust QB2 type of player, and I'm not really a believer in his weapons. I'm not a huge Amari Cooper guy. I'm not a big Jerry Jeudy fan. And the running back situation's a bit of a mess in Cleveland. So I am out on the Cleveland offense pretty much as a whole, and that's largely because of Deshaun Watson. Another team whose offense I'm a little bit worried about outside of the running back, that's the New York Jets. So Aaron Rodgers is the third player at quarterback on my bust list, and he is ranked as QB 31 on Keep Trade Cut. Obviously, he is an elder statesman. He's coming off an Achilles injury, which I think is still going to affect his play to a certain level. And it could affect Kirk Cousins a bit too. He's somebody else coming off that injury, but Cousins, I think, just was a far superior quarterback in the last full season that we saw for each of them. And just a totally different scenario. I think age too comes into play there. And so sticking back to Aaron Rodgers, focusing on him, doesn't have a great offensive line, should be marginally improved, but still is not going to be one of the better lines in the league. I think is going to lack mobility, both because of age and because of his injury. I just don't think he's going to have that ability to run around and make plays happen that was really what made him so special as a player. I mean, we used to see him just make things happen out of almost, it seemed like nothing, right? Just scrambles around the pocket, rolls out, finds a receiver down the field. I don't think we're going to get that from him anymore. I think he's purely going to be like a pocket passer, and I think that's bad news for fantasy. So certainly his age will be a reason that his fantasy value and dynasty value will drop at this time next year, but I think it will drop more than it would normally because I don't think he's going to be very good. He finished as QB 13 in his last full season in Green Bay, and now it's, a couple years later, an injury later. His weapons are, he's got Garrett Wilson, which he's a great receiver. I love Garrett Wilson. I think he's a very talented player. Breece Hall at running back, special player. So 2 elite skill position players around him, but outside of those 2, it's, a broken Mike Williams, rookie in Malachi Corley, his old buddy Alan Lazard. So I just don't I'm not that excited. I don't believe in Nate Hackett as his offensive coordinator. Is in a tough division. I don't see it. So while QB 31 is a pretty low price tag, I don't think he's somebody that you can count on as your QB2 in Dynasty. I think it's a QB3, bye week fill in at best. And it won't surprise me to see the wheels fall off and, whether he even plays in 2025, I think is still a big question mark. And if he struggles and he can't maneuver around the pocket as well as he used to, and, the team misses the playoffs or things like that, I will not be surprised if this is Aaron Rodgers' last season in the NFL. And even if it's not, I think you're looking at 2 years at most, and I'm not interested in that in terms of having a low-level starter with no upside, no ceiling. I think that's gone. It's part of the past. So moving on to running back, we're going to shift a little bit younger. Of course, coming from Aaron Rodgers, that's not going to be hard to do, but 3 players that, pretty big names. So I'm going to start with a player that is ranked the highest on Keep Trade Cut right now, and that is DeAndre Swift. So he's ranked as running back 17. He's only 25 years old, but he's being valued as the RB17 despite not ever finishing better than RB20 on the year. So I think that's a little bit interesting just in and of itself, but it's also largely due to his contract situation. He did get paid in the offseason. He got a 3-year deal with the Bears. So he does have a little bit more stability than other running backs in this range, which of course is very important for dynasty value, which is why I actually think he's relatively fairly priced. I don't think that it's that crazy to have him where he is, but I do think it shows you just how bad the running back market is, especially once you get past about the top 15 or so. On Keep Trade Cut, I think Josh Jacobs is RB15, and I think that's about the last guy that I'd be comfortable with as a locked and loaded starter on my dynasty team. So certainly Swift is somebody that is probably in your starting lineup, given the fact that there just is not a lot of depth at the position. So he'll start for the majority of teams that he's on. He can certainly be flexed if he's not one of your top 2 running backs. However, I think there's a little bit too much hype here. I think that we could be in for a big, downfall, something similar to like a Miles Sanders. He's a very efficient running back. He does have talent, so I don't want to just say that this is some guy that is going to provide nothing at all. However, I don't think there's really a ceiling for DeAndre Swift. I don't see the world where he is a top 15 running back, a top 18 running back. I think you're probably looking at a running back 3, somebody in the late, mid to late 20s. And I don't think that's going to be all that helpful for you from a week-to-week standpoint, considering the fact that you were probably counting on him to be a running back 2. He's on a new team with a worse offense, a rookie quarterback, a more crowded backfield, worse offensive line. I mean, I don't really know what is better about his situation now than it was last year with the Eagles. Should the Bears offense be better than it has been? Absolutely. I mean, Caleb Williams, they brought in, Keenan Allen, Rome Odunze. They still have other weapons there in DJ Moore and Cole Kmet. So it should be a much improved offense, and especially from a passing game standpoint. But I just have a hard time believing that DeAndre Swift is going to be better in Chicago than he was in Philadelphia, where he had an elite offensive line, still had a great offense around him. Sure, he probably had some touchdowns taken away from him by Jalen Hurts that you may get some of that with Caleb Williams, but certainly not to the same level. So interestingly enough, you could see a situation where he doesn't necessarily produce as much in terms of yards and receptions and everything, but he maybe tacks on a couple extra touchdowns. But to me, it's such a risky scenario here because there is still Khalil Herbert, Roshan Johnson. I mean, I would have to imagine there's going to be some emphasis on the passing game, given the fact that they added Caleb Williams and Keenan Allen and Rome Odunze. So with all that being said, I don't see the ceiling. I think there's some very significant risk here given the fact that he has not ever been better than running back 20. And if he fails to beat that mark in Chicago and, he finishes as the RB28 or the RB31 or something like that, his dynasty value, I think, is going to come crashing down and would drop, I would imagine, at least to the back half of the 20s because at that point, the situation's not going to necessarily be that much better for him in 2025 with another year, more wear and tear, all that sort of thing. So DeAndre Swift is the first running back on my bust list. Now, second on this list is Ramondre Stevenson of the New England Patriots. So running back 28, which, there is some level of upside here. I actually think that the ceiling for somebody like Stevenson could be higher than Swift, but I think that the risk of just completely falling apart and being almost entirely worthless in Dynasty next year, that risk is significantly higher with Stevenson. He was banged up a decent amount of last year, especially at the end of the season. That's where we saw Zeke Elliott take over that starting job and give us some useful fantasy weeks. But he's on a bad offense, rookie quarterback. There's really no, elite weapons at all on this offense. So at least, compared directly to Swift, that offense, the Bears offense should be much better than the Patriots offense. But Stevenson was not efficient. He had less than 4 yards per carry last year. And they added Antonio Gibson, who I think is a better pass catcher. So I won't be surprised if this turns into a true committee. And not only should that tank his value a bit, but if he suffers any kind of injury, misses time, he's going to be another year older in a bad offense. I just don't think that this is a player that people are going to be excited about having on the roster. They're not going to be excited about putting him into their starting lineup. And there's going to be some significant downside to Ramondre Stevenson this year. So that's why he makes this list as my second running back. Running back 3 is somebody who has been a great running back, a great dynasty asset, but I think his time is up, and that is Nick Chubb of the Cleveland Browns. So he's being valued on Keep Trade Cut as running back 37, but he suffered a brutal injury last year, and he's 28 years old. I just don't see him regaining any real dynasty value from this point. I would much rather have Jerome Ford in all formats. And he's being valued as the running back 42, which I think is very interesting that Ford is being valued less than Nick Chubb. I don't think Chubb is going to be able to handle a workload like he's been in the past. I don't even know if he's going to be healthy enough to, really be on the field at the beginning of the season. I am avoiding him pretty much at all costs. He's, he's pretty much worthless to me in terms of dynasty. I don't see him as somebody that really has any value, because I don't think he can be even, remotely close to what he was in the past, which, was great, but I think his best days are behind him. He's at, to me, best case scenario, he's in a very crowded committee in Cleveland. Jerome Ford, I think, is going to be the lead guy in that backfield. There is Donta Foreman signed. So Nick Chubb, I think, is going to be more of in just a rotational role. They're going to try to keep him fresh. He'll get some first down carries, could see some goal line work. But again, I think any projection that has him, inside the top 36 at running back is not something I'm interested in. I don't think he is going to be useful at all for fantasy. I think in redraft, he's somebody that I would probably not even consider drafting. And in Dynasty, you're probably not going to be able to get a ton for him on the trade market, but if you can get something, particularly if you can flip him directly for Ford, who is younger and I think going to be the starter, I would make that move in a heartbeat. So if you can get something of value for him, otherwise he's just a bench depth piece, hope that you can plug him in on a bye week, but even then, I think that's a risky bet. So Nick Chubb, somebody that I am completely out on in 2024 and beyond for Dynasty. I want to make one honorable mention, and this is a player that I don't think is a bust, so I don't want that, to be confused here as me saying this player is a bust. But I do think we could be in for a minor disappointment this season from Jonathan Taylor, who is the running back 5 on Keep Trade Cut. I'm a big Jonathan Taylor fan. I have him on a bunch of different teams, but I do think that there is some significant risk that he's not going to be a top 5 running back in 2024. I think he'll still be top 10, top 12, but I'm not sure that he has quite the same ceiling with Anthony Richardson at quarterback. I think that Richardson is somebody that, assuming he stays healthy, will be able to vulture some touchdowns away at the goal line. So, just something to be aware of. I don't know that he's somebody that I'd be taking, too early. I think an underdog, he's going in the mid-second round as the 3rd running back off the board. I don't think I have him in really, I think maybe 1 or 2 teams out of a whole bunch on underdog, but he's not somebody that I'm that interested in terms of redraft at his current price. Dynasty, I think he's a fine player to have on your roster. He'll still be very good for you. That offense should be great. I trust Shane Steichen to get the ball into his best players' hands. We saw Zach Moss be extremely good at times last year, and Taylor as well was pretty good last year when he was healthy. But a lot of that was of course without Anthony Richardson. So we don't really know, what that's going to look like with all those players there and healthy. So just something to be aware of. I'm not advocating moving on from him or avoiding him necessarily, because I actually think that there are a lot of people that are sort of quietly worried about him. So he could be somebody that you could get for cheaper than market value because of these risks. But just something to be aware of. I don't know that he's going to be, he's not going to have that humongous season like he did a few years ago in 2024. Moving on to wide receivers, I'm going to start with a player that I mentioned last week that I think if you've listened to a number of these shows throughout this year, you probably have picked up on the fact that I don't think Stephon Diggs is going to be that great this year. So Stephon Diggs is the first player on my list. He's currently wide receiver 41, and I do think that the market has corrected itself a lot on Stephon Diggs. I mean, he was earlier in the offseason, he was still in the late 20s. Now I think wide receiver 41 is much more fair, but I still think he is being valued too highly, especially on Underdog. If you play best ball, I think he's going way too high. And for Dynasty, the reason I think that he's a bust, I think he's the wide receiver 3 in Houston. I would much rather have Tank Dell and Nico Collins over Stephon Diggs in all formats, whether it's redraft, best ball, Dynasty, you name it. I would prefer those 2 players to Stephon Diggs. I think he's going to be on the field a lot. I think he's going to have, some moments, but this is a player that, we saw him struggle throughout the season, especially those last, the second half of the season really, and into the playoffs. He couldn't get it done with Josh Allen as the clear wide receiver 1 on his team. What makes any of us think that he can get it done with CJ Stroud, who, while very good, I don't think is Josh Allen level, and it's a much more crowded wide receiver room. So I don't see a world where he is better than last year. I think he's going to put up some mediocre numbers, some solid. He'll have some solid weeks. I'm not saying this is somebody that you can't ever start. Chances are, if you have him, you will be playing him, but don't be surprised if he disappoints or gives you migraines as you try to figure out, okay, is this the week that I should have him in my lineup or not? The one good thing about this is we should know pretty quickly in the season whether or not where he ranks in the pecking order for this team. So after 2 or 3 games, we'll know what CJ Stroud really thinks of Stephon Diggs. Or whether he is still going to be targeting guys like Tank Dell and Nico Collins over Diggs. So that's why he's on this list. I don't think that the market is necessarily all that wrong on him. I do think he still has some value, but he's somebody that I'm completely avoiding, that I think his value will drop even further next year, both because of play situation and age. But he'll be a free agent as well. When Houston acquired him, they rearranged his contract, so he's on a 1-year deal. So it's kind of depends on whether you think he's going to be good enough to put himself in a spot where he'll be the clear number one on some other team in 2025. If you think he can do that, then, you maybe have a better view of him than I do. But I'm out. I'm out on Stephon Diggs, and I'm much more excited about Nico Collins and Tank Dell. Number 2 on my list at wide receiver is T. Higgins, another player that I have in a few spots, and I thought he would be better. The injuries certainly have not been helping. He's wide receiver 23 on Keep Trade Cut, which, as I've mentioned on a number of these players, relatively fair. However, I don't think he can really ever rise back up above this. So that is the number 1 reason why I have him on the bust list, and that's because he's going to be stuck behind Jamar Chase this year. He's got his contract dispute. We'll see how that plays out, whether he, misses more of off-season workouts and training camp and things like that, or how that affects the start of his season. But he's had issues staying on the field and staying healthy already as it is. Factor in, another year. They drafted Jermaine Burton. The team doesn't necessarily seem committed to keeping him long-term. So if he does struggle, if he does suffer another injury, we're talking about somebody that's going to be moving on to a new team, going to be another year older. I think he's a much better best ball player than he is a dynasty or redraft player, because he does have some spike weeks, but it's a little bit more difficult to predict when that's going to happen, which is why I think he is going to give you some issues when you try to set your lineups every week to figure out, how confident are you in him being a starter. He's ranked too highly. He has too much talent to bench, but he's also not consistent enough to, leave you feeling all that happy about having him on your team. So I don't think this is somebody. T. Higgins is probably the number 1 player on this list where I don't think his value is going to just completely drop off the face of the earth like a lot of the other players on this list. But I do think we'll see a situation where it drops into the 30s next year. I could see him going from 23 to, anywhere from that 30 to 33 type of range, which to me, at the wide receiver position, which is so important, and the way that, people talk about Higgins, I think that's a pretty significant drop that will qualify him as a bust. Number 3 is a player that I kind of went back and forth on about whether or not to include because he's already valued so low. And that's Courtland Sutton from the Denver Broncos. He's wide receiver 60 on Keep Trade Cut, so he's pretty cheap to acquire. However, he is 28. He had 10 touchdowns last year, and he's somebody that I think will see some regression, especially in that touchdown category with Bo Nix at quarterback. I think he's somebody that can be a fine bench player, plug in on some buys, but I don't think he's somebody that you can count on as a starter, and his best days are behind him. So I think between the regression and, the rookie quarterback, which is probably not going to be able to support him being, any sort of high-level wide receiver. I believe he was wide receiver 35 or so last year. And so I think that's probably about his ceiling, and I don't know that, I think we're going to see a pretty big drop from there, I guess is what I'm trying to point out. So while he certainly has some weekly upside from a, fill-in standpoint, as some depth on your bench, can't count on him as a starter, and there's a lot of competition now as well. So, Jerry Jeudy got traded, which, you'd think, okay, that's great. But when you factor in being a new rookie quarterback, they drafted Troy Franklin, who went to college at Oregon with Bo Nix. So I think there's going to be some, chemistry there. Marvin Mims, I think we should see him with a bigger role as well, probably taking over the Jerry Jeudy spot in the lineup. So I'm not that excited about Courtland Sutton. I think he's an okay player to have on your bench, like I've said, but I think we could see a pretty big drop off in terms of his production. He's never been like a high volume player. He's been a deep threat touchdown type of guy. And when you have a rookie quarterback who, not only is a rookie, but also is somebody that is kind of more effective in the shorter passing game, I just don't think that mixes well for Courtland Sutton, and I would not be surprised if he's traded at some point whether it's before the season or at the trade deadline, whatever it may be. I won't be surprised to see him be moved by the Broncos. Moving on to tight end, which is a bit more of a difficult position actually to come up with a bust list at, because there's only so many guys that are really fantasy relevant. I could come on here and say, oh, the tight end 37 is going to be a bust, but there's not 37 relevant fantasy tight ends anyways that can truly qualify as being a bust, because I do think you have to be somebody that will be counted on for something at some point in the season to be able to be considered a bust. So I've got a couple players that are all top 11 in keep trade cut value right now at the position. So I'm going to start with David Njoku, who is tight end 11 on keep trade cut. He is somebody that really kind of broke out last year. He had a really nice season. He was just awesome during the fantasy playoffs. But 2023 was also the first time that he finished as a top 10 tight end since 2018. And he did it primarily without Deshaun Watson. So even though he was great, he had a combined 100 points between weeks 14 and 17, including 2 30 bombs, which is just, that's mind-blowing, incredible production from the tight end position. However, that was all with Joe Flacco, who is gone. He's now the backup with the Colts. And so he averaged 10 points per game with Watson in their 5 games together. He had almost 14 points per game without him. So I think that's a pretty sizable jump per game. And so when you factor in that he is 28, which, from a tight end perspective is still, it's not as old as it would be if, he played running back or anything, or even wide receiver for that matter. So I'm not all that worried about his age. But I just don't see any world where he improves on his current value. And I think we're in for a fairly significant drop-off in production. So I would expect him to drop into the mid-teens in terms of tight end value because, mid to late teens, there's going to be some regression. Unless Deshaun Watson just completely turns it around and, goes back to his Houston days where he's a top 5, top 10 player, I'm not sure that David Njoku is going to receive enough volume and just have good enough quarterback play to justify his current price in the tight end landscape. So number 2 is George Kittle, who comes in at tight end 10 on Keep Trade Cut. He's 30 years old, and this is somebody that I think I've mentioned before on the show as somebody that I was, more interested in trading away than adding to my rosters. That's still the case. And in fact, we had recent news that Kittle had core muscle surgery this offseason, which is a pretty difficult injury to come back from, especially right away. It's not that he can't, return and be effective, but, and actually it sounds like he played through it a bit for the back half of last season, which is extremely impressive. He's always been a very tough player. Nobody questions that. But George Kittle is a boom-bust play for your lineup. He's kind of, he's been like that a lot in the past few seasons, which can make it very difficult from a week-to-week standpoint as a manager to just know that, you could get 4 points or you could get 40 points. It's kind of a big roller coaster ride here with George Kittle, right? Last season, you would have been happy having him in your lineup about half of the time, which, sure, at tight end, is that fine? Yes. I, however, prefer a little bit more consistency. I, am okay with, maybe a slightly lower ceiling, but a higher floor when it comes to the tight end position, just because I want to make sure I'm just, getting some level of points, that are impactful on a week-to-week basis, and I'll let my other stars, handle those boom, weeks in my lineup. So George Kittle, there's a lot of mouths to feed, right, in San Francisco, especially if there's no wide receiver trade that sends away Deebo Samuel or Brandon Ayuk. If that happens before the season, I would probably remove Kittle from this list. So I want to add that little caveat in because then things become a little bit less crowded. I think he would become, he's right now, he's probably the fourth option in the receiving game for San Francisco because they have Ayuk, they have Deebo Samuel. And they have Christian McCaffrey, who catches a ton of passes. So that's what makes it so difficult, is because they have such electric weapons, but especially with McCaffrey in some of the shorter passing game. So between the injury risk, the competition, his age, he's 30 years old, like I said, and I think there's going to be some regression. Last season, he had a career high in yards per catch, and so I think there's a pretty good bet for that to come back down a little bit, which should, hurt his impact. So all those things taken together, George Kittle on my bust list for 2024. And last but not least, the final player I want to talk about today is somebody that it's cheating a little bit, because I don't really think he's a true dynasty bust per se. I don't know that he quite meets the definition that I laid out at the beginning of the show. However, this is somebody that certainly from a redraft standpoint, a best ball standpoint, somebody that I think I'm not interested in acquiring in Dynasty right now, even at his current price. And that's TJ Hawkinson from the Vikings. He's currently tight end 7 on Keep Trade Cut, which for somebody that has been as good as he has been would seem like a bit of a discount. But I think that's, of course, factoring in the fact that he's going to miss a huge chunk of the 2024 season, at least half, most likely, which in my mind, I think you probably have to consider this fall a lost season for Hawkinson. I don't think you can count on him at all under any circumstances to come back and give you elite fantasy production to help your team, get into the playoffs, be successful in the playoffs. It's really more of a situation where the only time I'd really be interested in adding TJ Hawkinson is if I'm in a rebuild, I'm a rebuilding team, and if you're a league that plays with max points for as your how you determine draft order for the top 6, those teams that miss the playoffs. So you could take advantage there and acquire him in a situation where he's on a contending team that doesn't want to take that hit at the position. But you as a rebuilder, if he doesn't score any points this year, that's perfectly fine with you. I think that's the scenario where I'm okay with going after him. But other than that, I'm pretty much out on Hawkinson. I don't like the fact that he's going to miss so much time. He's going to have a rookie quarterback when he comes back, who, while I think JJ McCarthy will be very good, I have made it clear over the course of draft season that I was a big JJ McCarthy fan. I think Minnesota's a great fit. There is a little bit more risk there compared to when Kirk Cousins was in town, and so I'm very wary of the situation, because I don't like adding injured players, and JJ McCarthy's going to have a lot of time to forge a connection with Justin Jefferson and Jordan Addison, and those two players I think will end up being the top 2 targets for him, even when Hawkinson comes back. So we saw Kirk Cousins support all 3 players last season, but I think that's a lot to ask of a rookie to be able to do the same sort of thing, certainly in the first year or 2 of his career. So TJ Hawkinson he's kind of half on this list, right? I don't think he's entirely a bust, because I do think he will still have fantasy value in the future, and likely be considered, a top 10 tight end in fantasy football. But I think that, something more in that 7 to 10, 8 to 10 range is probably where he's going to be from here on out. So from that sense, there will be some loss in value. I think he will struggle this year. I don't think you're going to get anything fantasy useful from him. And so for those reasons, he does make this list. So there you have it. That is everybody on my Dynasty bust list for this year, and we're going to do a quick run through of all the players just in case you missed anything. At quarterback, our 3 busts were Bryce Young, Deshaun Watson, and Aaron Rodgers. At running back, it was DeAndre Swift, Ramondre Stevenson, and Nick Chubb. At wide receiver, it was Stephon Diggs, T. Higgins, and Courtland Sutton. And at tight end, David Njoku, George Kittle, and TJ Hawkinson. So there you have it. Thank you all very much for tuning in. I appreciate you for listening. Again, show announcement from the top of the show. We are starting a listener league, a new Dynasty startup. If you are interested in joining the Dynasty League, you are invited. If you're listening to this, reach out to me on Twitter at Dynasty War Room. Send me an email. Our email address for the show is dynastywarroompodcast@gmail.com. Reach out to me any way you can. You can find the show on all social media, and we'll be happy to get you in the league. And we'll send you a copy of the bylaws. We'll have the whole thing typed up and ready to go. So excited for that, and we'll talk to you all next week. Thanks so much.